All right, guys. We'll go ahead and get started because in the first session I ran a little short on the fun stuff at the end, which is where I get to really highlight all the awesome things my students have been doing for the past 2 weeks. So we're going to go ahead and get started. First of all, I am Tara Wright. I am a math teacher at Hart County High School. And we've been virtual for a good majority of the year, but we have been in person for all of our last quarter that we're currently in right now. And for the past 2 weeks, my students have been doing a STEM project, the first real STEM project we've got to do together in person. And I've even adapted it for my virtual classes. And I'm going to start off talking a little bit. My goal of today is to talk about how integrating those STEM disciplines in our classroom can actually help us to allow our students more chances to demonstrate these mathematical practices. And so I'm going to share with you a little bit about what I've learned over the past year as I've gone through the Endeavor courses as part of the STEM CS grant and the shift in my thinking as a teacher of what I need to be doing to best prepare my students for life outside of my classroom, but also get into some great things that my kids have been doing here. So, to begin, I would like to know what your all's current definition of STEM is and what that might look like in your classroom. And I know I have some administrators here as well, so maybe consider what STEM looks like in your school or district as well. We're going to be using a Desmos activity to kind of get some engagement and feedback from you guys throughout our session today. So if you have a device, you can join. Let me pull up that. You can join by going to student.desmos.com and using that code. And if you do not have a device, I do also have that QR code that you can pull up on your phone to still share. The only thing on your phone, you probably won't be able to easily do the card sort, but I'll have the cards up here and you can kind of just look through those off the screen as well. So I'm going to join that. The first task that's going to be there on your screen is just to share what your current thinking of what STEM is and what it looks like in your classroom or school or district currently. Is there anybody still needing the code? So I believe the activity is set up to where you guys are going to be able to see one another's responses, and we'll kind of look at the feedback there just to kind of get an idea of where we're all coming from. So I'm going to share my teacher dashboard of our Desmos activity so we can kind of see all the responses coming in.
I gotta hurry up. Yeah, takes the call at me. Oh.
The phone's not as user-friendly for Desmos, but it'll make do for some of the text responses I'm asking from you guys. And we'll just adapt to be flexible like we teachers are. Otherwise. Thank you to those who have already shared the responses. Anybody that might be having technology difficulties, anybody want to share out with the mic what your definition of STEM is or what that currently looks like in your classroom? So STEM is integration across subject areas with student-driven questions around the natural world. STEM is real. Science in the math classroom. Great responses. So while a few are kind of finishing up sharing their ideas, I'm gonna talk to you guys a little bit about where I'm coming from and how I've gotten where I'm at as far as what I feel like STEM is. So when we first started these endeavor courses through the STEM CS grant, I was fortunate enough to have a background, and I went through the Sky Teach program at Western. So I knew, I was part of the first report. I knew how important STEM was, and I had been trained with the 5E model and things like that, and I saw that. And as soon as I did the classroom, accountability, standardized testing, it was like all the things that I had learned in my pre-service stuff was like drained out of me because I was so focused and concerned about all those other things. And so I fell back into the way I had been taught of just guided practice, and we want our students to be able to get to the correct answer. We want to be efficient with our time because we have so many content, skills, and concepts to teach our students that we feel rushed, and we want to teach the tricks and the tips to get them there. And so I knew that STEM meant pulling in that science and technology and engineering into my mathematics classroom because I'm a mathematics teacher, but I felt like I teach math. Math is my job. I'll take care of the math. I'll know the math in my classroom, and the science teacher will take care of science. And unfortunately, our school, we don't really have an engineering or technology program for our students. So, when we could pull those in, we can. But through my work in the Endeavor courses, I've really seen ways that I can pull in the science and the technology and the engineering to make my mathematics that I'm teaching my students stronger and actually mean something to them. Because how many of us get the question, when am I ever going to use this? It was like ultimate frustration and pet peeve, because in Algebra 1 and geometry, when I taught those subject areas, I could typically pull out a good answer and give them something relevant to them that was somewhat engaging to them. And then when I get to Algebra 2, and we're doing more complex functions and things like that, we're in a rural area, and my students just didn't relate to some of that level of mathematics, and I didn't have a strong enough science background and things to know where to look for those engaging phenomena. But the Endeavor courses have really brought some of that data and some of that engaging phenomena context to light to me, and I'm able to know where to look. Now, I'm going to share some of that with you too. So let's get into the next thing. So I want to talk a little bit about integrating STEM in the classroom. So there are different levels of integration of STEM in education. And so we read a couple articles in my first nature of STEM class that we took in the Endeavor course, and I pulled some definitions from there. So Nadelson and Seifert said in an article that we read that integrated STEM, the definition is a seamless amalgamation of content and concepts from multiple STEM disciplines. The integration takes place in ways such that knowledge and process of the scientific STEM disciplines are considered simultaneously without regard to discipline. So like I said before, I taught math, and occasionally when I pulled in a science concept to make things more real world, I was like, well, see, we're talking about science. But now the truth is math, science, engineering, technology, all those things work together seamlessly. So we really don't have to know that they're separate entities because they all work together to solve the common problems or context. And then more in a separate article that we read, defined integrated STEM as an effort to combine some or all four of the disciplines of science, technology, engineering, mathematics into one class, unit, or lesson that's based on the connections between the subjects and the real world problems. And what I love most about this definition is he points out, we can't integrate STEM in every moment. In Algebra 2, I can't integrate STEM into every single thing I teach, because sometimes I do need to focus on those mathematics contents and skills, but I can make a more intentional and concentrated effort to pull it into at least one lesson or one unit to make things that I'm teaching to my students more meaningful to them. So here we have a diagram from one of the articles that we read, that the Seifert and Nadelson article, that I found really eye-opening. This is the STEM spectrum. And so our teacher in that course had asked us to rate where we felt we landed on this STEM scale, the STEM spectrum. And before all this, I was like over there on the segregated arrow, because like I said before, I felt like my job was math, and science teachers taught science, and it was all knowledge level, and we were just trying. I felt like I had to just get through the content, and I needed to be able to get the answer, but I wasn't diving as deep as I should have been. And so the integrated STEM is going to be much more project level, where it's more ill-structured, it's higher order thinking, it's that conceptual understanding. And then we want to try to live somewhere in the middle, right? We can't be completely integrated STEM all the time with the way that, we have expectations for accountability and things too. We have to focus on just our continuity, but we want to dance in the middle of the spectrum. And so I would like you guys to, in that Desmos activity, I'm going to change the slide that we're looking at, right where you feel like you currently are on that STEM spectrum. Where do you feel like in your classroom, your school, your district, that you're engaging students in true STEM? Is it more segregated, integrated, or somewhere in the middle? And like I said, I started out way on that segregated end, but I feel like I'm making small baby steps toward integrating more and more. And what's great about this Desmos activity is I can overlay our responses so we can kind of see where the group as a whole falls. Awesome. So we're all at different levels, but the good thing is we can all make steps in a direction. I'm hoping today that you'll leave this session with some resources and some ideas for how you might can make some baby steps toward the integrated side if you're still living over where I was in the segregated spot. Okay. So the next thing I just want to look at really quickly, and I promise we're going to get to the fun stuff where I get to brag on my students' work in just a little bit, but I want to look at standards versus practices. And so I've pulled some samples of 8th grade mathematics standards. I just tried to pick like middle kind of grade level to look at. And then I've included the mathematical practices here on the right. So I'm typically very focused on the standards because that's what we're assessed on, and we want to make sure that our students can perform those skills, they can demonstrate that knowledge, that understanding. And so students in 8th grade are supposed to be able to do things like solving linear equations in one variable, knowing the plot properties of integer exponents, comparing properties of two functions, things like that. And then you have the mathematical practices over here on the right, which are things like make sense of problems and perseverance solving, and reason abstractly and quantitatively. So I want to talk a little bit about the difference. So the standards are going to establish what students should know and be able to do at the conclusion of a course, right? They're balanced. They're supposed to be a balanced combination of procedure and understanding. So it's what we want our students to know and be able to do to show us that they learn the content for our course. Now, on the flip side of that, the practices describe ways in which our students as developing mathematicians are meant to engage with our subject matter. And that's how they show their level of knowledge and understanding of the mathematics we're teaching them. And I was guilty of focusing so much on making sure that they performed on those assessments and those tests to show me that they could do the skill, that I wasn't being intentional about looking for ways to allow them to demonstrate these mathematical practices, which are just as important when we're teaching. So really, a lack of understanding of the content means students are going to struggle being able to demonstrate the mathematical practices, because when I'm doing guided practice and I have a problem on the board and my students are just kind of monkey see, monkey do, they're gonna, mimic what I did on the board and just try to replace my numbers with what they think their numbers are, and just kind of follow the leader without really understanding what they're doing. They're not going to be able to construct an argument because the reason they're able, that's what you did it. In fact, I have a video from yesterday as evidence of one of my practices where a student did that. I was like, that was not what I wanted to hear. But it turned into a really good conversation where they did demonstrate understanding of the structure of the equation they were solving. So it was a good learning moment. A quote that I found recently that ended up just tying perfectly with this, I think it's a paraphrase of something that Einstein said, is that education is not the learning of facts, rather the training of the mind to think. And so if we're trying to train our students to be thinkers, independent thinkers, to be successful in the world outside of our classroom, we need to be incorporating these mathematical practices. I was talking through this presentation with my husband last night, and he is a supervisor at Kentucky Chrome Works in First K. So he works at a factory and they chrome wheels. And so as I was kind of talking through to get the nerves out of what I planned, I was telling him the difference between standards and practices, and I said, do you remember the last time that you had to solve a linear equation in one variable? He was like, nope. And I said, what about, constructing a function to model a linear relationship? Do you remember the last time you did that? So, But I said, do you remember the last time that you had to attend to precision? And he's like, well, yeah, I had a guy that working for me that put the wrong amount of chemical in a tank the other day. We had to drag the whole tank because it threw off the chemical balance and it was going to mess up the wheels. And so I said, what about using appropriate tools strategically? Yeah, I have to measure what's in the tanks all the time and keep it within a certain. So these enduring skills are the things that we need to be incorporated with our content as we teach it, so that our students are more prepared to face whatever challenges they might encounter in life beyond our classroom, whether it's post-secondary school or going into the job force. So we're going to talk about how integrating STEM can help us better challenge our students, but I got a quick card sort that I would like for you guys to do. So this is the next thing in our Desmos activity. If you are on a device, this is the part where if you're on a phone, it might not be as user-friendly. So I'm going to pull up the student view and just have the cards displayed up here. But if you will sort these cards, I've just put some different phrases on these cards. And if you click and drag them on top of one another, it creates your groups. So I want you to just group them into any number of groups, any way you want. I'm hoping that you will just look for patterns in what you read. I'm trying to sort these out so where if you don't have your device, you're going to still be able to easily see these. And we're going to talk about how you group them. So the one thing I ask is that however you choose to group them, you have a title for that group or a reason behind why you group them together. So I'm going to give you guys just a few minutes to think through what you would put together. And I hope that some of you guys will share out what you think. As long as you have a reason for why it all goes together, Mr. Chisel, that is fine. That's an acceptable grouping. I'm by no means am a Desmos expert, but I got really frustrated with trying to keep virtually and keeping kids engaged. So I tried it and getting a little bit better at it. We can do it. We can do it. That's what I love most about Desmos is the card sorts and get them sketching on the graph. They actually have to do it rather than it's like Delta Math where they input the answer and it immediately tells them if it's right or wrong, and we can't really keep that.
Yeah, they're using Desmos to graph their document.
Yes. Yes, they are. And even my virtual students are engaged this way, doing the same stuff. few more minutes. Is there anybody who already has some ideas of how they group they would be willing to share? What patterns or groupings that you noticed?
Use appropriate tools strategically, use a variety of technologies within a design to identify.
So how would you title that group? We're supposed to use this
Use
group.
appropriate tools strategically, and then under that I would put use a variety of technologies within the design process to identify. Oh,
So well, why would you group those together?
because you're using technology as a tool.
Perfect. So we could probably form a grouping, maybe even with some other phrases up here that you see where you're using tools. I might even throw in, I think there's one that says using strategies. Technology strategy, develop and employ strategies that strategies are tools to me. So I might even throw that one in. Any other groupings that you notice? Things that you would put together that you all want to share?
One of the factors of more of a design process.
You want to share?
One I look at more create prototype, that's more of a physical design process, steps involved when you take the physical design process. It's like how do I actually break down or what we call top-down design of an actual problem. So all those all integrate together and actually separate each one of the top-down design process, just break smaller and smaller components. Actually work on solve and work with that.
So one's more of a design process, one more like the problem solving type process.
Break it down, one is a problem approach, one is the actual how do I create something approach.
Creating versus
One's
breaking it.
house, all these things together that you try to break apart, see which connection builds it as a design process.
Awesome. That's a new grouping that hasn't been shared. That's the awesome connections. Okay, so the trick to this, there was no trick. The reason I chose these phrases, for the record, I actually pulled out 3 to 5 standards for mathematical practices of the science practices from the NGSS standards, the steps of the engineering process, and 3 of these are the actual ISTE technology standards. So these are essentially the standards and or practices that you are supposed to help your students demonstrate in mathematics or science or engineering or technology. But notice how not a single person actually grouped them or explained that, hey, this all deals with math. This is all what you're supposed to do in science, and this is all what you're supposed to do in engineering, this is all what you're supposed to do in technology. Because the truth is, a lot of these are overlapping. So, like, if you are actually looking at how they're intended to be grouped together, then you have the practices from the different disciplines. But if I were to group these without knowing that, I would put things together like using the tool strategically or that design process you're talking about. Those were probably a lot of the engineering steps because you're creating prototypes and you're testing your design. There's a lot of data analysis, mathematical modeling, things like that that I would group together, and then identifying problems or persevering in problem solving. Those were all about identifying what the problem is that you are intended to tackle. So I just wanted us to do this activity to highlight that, you know, when you're implementing those mathematical practices in the math classroom, you're also hitting on some of those science practices, and you're hitting on some of those engineering practices, and you're incorporating technology typically when you're using graphing tools like Desmos, or you're using those graphing calculators or other types of tools. So I was hoping you would see the connections and why it's important to integrate this STEM and how it kind of kills multiple birds with one stone when you integrate these in your classroom. So a few more quotes from those articles I referenced earlier. This one's from the Nagelson and Seifert article. The focus on integrated STEM approach to teaching and learning requires that students and teachers are aware of when and how to apply the knowledge and practices across the disciplines. So it's that application of knowledge that allows students to develop that even deeper understanding of the STEM concepts and how they're interrelated. And I love this diagram that I found, where we take the knowledge and skills and we weave it in with those real world situations to create that deeper conceptual understanding for our kids. And so the context, when we choose to incorporate that real world phenomenon, or that real world context for their learning, it provides a means of scaffolding by providing a process or project that allows them to explore the multiple facets of knowledge. And it enhances the meaningfulness and relevancy of what they learn, and it elevates that student motivation and engagement. And I can attest to this because the last 2 weeks, my students, you see some of their work up here, they've been building rockets. And we're just now into the data analysis phase of this. So they've done the build, they've done the data collection, and they're starting to incorporate the mathematics. But for 2 weeks, I have not heard one complaint from my students. In fact, they come in my room and they're reading rockets today. And in Algebra 2, that's a rarity, okay? And so it's been really exciting to see how much they're getting from this. And typically I hand back work that's graded and they're like, wad up, throw it away. But now they saw their rocket perform, like, we're gonna get to read this, right? We're gonna get a chance to shoot these off again because I know I can make this better. And that's awesome. And they're using data to make more informed decisions for how they can make their rocket better. So I'm seeing that motivation and engagement by incorporating these STEM disciplines. So I want to compare a few learning tasks. So I told you that I used to live on that very segregated end of the STEM spectrum. And so what I typically would have done when it came to like this first standard for functions where you understand properties and key features of functions, Delta Math, it's awesome for virtual teaching. It's been great this year to give our students practicing and allow them the opportunity to get immediate feedback virtually and whatnot. But I actually pulled this question from Delta Math. So to me, this was a STEM question. It was mathematics, but it pulled in a real world context and incorporated science because we were talking about rocket launch, right? And so they're given the model, but they had to know how to use that model to find the time at which the rocket would reach its maximum. That was integrating STEM to me. And so I probably would have pulled up 3 or 4 of these examples and then guided practice with my students and showed them how they could use technology to help them graph the model on the coordinate plane and calculate the vertex and interpret their answer and all those things. And then they would have been given an assignment with 6 or 8 of these problems to do on Delta Math, and they would have completed it, and it would have been done. So if this was the type of problem my students were working, what kind of mathematical practices do you think they might be demonstrating as they work through this? Because to a small degree, they will employ some of the mathematical practices. What do you guys think?
Within reason abstractly.
They do have to be able to pull out, they're given a very abstract formula, and they've got to be able to pick out, okay, what part of my answer is going to be the time when I'm at the max. So they are going to have to reason abstractly. Okay, yes?
Model.
They're going to be using models if they graph it and represent it in a different way, yes?
They're taking to precision as well because they have to get this answer to the nearest 100th second.
Exactly, they have to attend to precision. So there are multiple mathematical practices we might see from our students as they work through this type of problem. But maybe not as in depth as we could get them if we integrated more STEM, right? So this is the way I might have used to teach this content, but this year I did something a little different, and I've built upon a rocket lab that I have done in the past, but I took a lot of the constraints off of it. So I made it much more, here's your challenge, go with it type thing, rather than here's your recipe for how to build a rocket. We're going to shoot it off. We're all going to have the same data. We're all going to do the same analysis and everything else. So I'm going to show you what I gave my students 2 weeks ago. They were handed this paper. I'd kind of teased them with, guys, this has been a trying school year. I'm ready to do something fun. I want to build rockets with you guys. And if we can get through, this time we'll build rockets in our next, topic that we're getting into. And so they kind of knew it was coming. They were excited about it, but I came in and I handed them this paper and it told them that their challenge is to design a rocket that's going to reach the greatest height when launched with an air compressor launch. And they had 5 criteria to meet, which we fortunately have a teacher with an engineering background in our building who kind of helped me set up like the dynamics they needed to really give them the engineering challenge behind this. So I gave them some criteria to meet. Some of it was important for how it would launch, and some of it was just, let's see if they can make it work with this set of limits. So they were given a certain set of materials they could use. They weren't allowed to bring in extra stuff from home unless it fell in one of these categories with the materials supplied for them. And they were given this rubric because they were going to be given a grade on their blueprint and build that they did. Okay, and so this was just for how they planned out and created the rocket to test. Okay, and then I told them after we collect our data, we're going to do some analysis. And they were given this rubric and guidelines for their final assessment. This is the process they're in right now. They are working on a Google slide presentation that's going to address the 5 following questions. And first of all, they use their collected data to create that algebraic model. So they're actually using the vertical motion formula to create the algebraic function that models their specific rocket path. Every 2 students that paired up are going to have a different model. They're going to use that algebraic model to then create the graph that represents the rocket's height as a function of time. Then we've been talking about the forces and the energy transfer that results in that quadratic model to help them understand why did it not just go like linear, straight up, straight down, and those things. And they're going to explain some of the science behind why it creates such a mathematical model, including energy and forces. And then they're going to use their models to calculate the max height. That's what the word problem did, and calculate the vertex. But here I'm tying in many more standards, and I'm going to have an opportunity to see much more depth in the mathematical practices they did demonstrate. And then last but not least, they're going to use all that data to help them make more informed decisions. I'm hoping that we have time to show you the rocket launch. I created an awesome rocket launch montage for you guys to see how they went, and we had some great launches. We had some major flubs. We had a few students that didn't even leave the tube because there were major airlift or something happening. And so you'll see successes and not great successes, but they're all eager to improve. And when I gave them the challenge, they were not asked to research rocketing at all, like rocket building. They didn't look at any science or data to make their decisions. They just decided to start building what was pretty to them, what they thought would work. And so they are currently seeing how that went. Now we're actually going to make more informed decisions as they modify their rockets, because we're going to use data and what we've learned about the science behind this to improve upon our designs. And of course, they were given a rubric for this part too. So we talked about the mathematical practices we might see to some degree in that word problem. Now I want to show you examples of my students demonstrating those mathematical practices as they worked for the last 2 weeks on these rockets. And so I brought some samples so you can see kind of what they've been building, and I'm going to show you some of the great things that I've had in my classroom. So mathematical practice 1 is making sense of problems and persevering in solving them. And so some of the examples I've seen of that, like I said before, students are dying to modify their rockets and launch again. They're excited for the opportunity to make corrections and improve their work. And that typically doesn't happen, at least not as to the degree that it is now with all students. Really excited about that opportunity. Another thing I wish I had caught on video, their second launch, but I had a group that like their first launch, like I said, didn't even leave the launcher. And they were kind of defeated, but I immediately saw them run off to the side and they're like they put popsicle sticks, I think, inside the body. They thought it would make it tighter, and I think it made it too tight on the tube. They're like, we had to rip those out. And they had a successful second launch. That was persevering and problem solving. And they were proud of that second trial that they had where it actually launched. And then here's a video of one of my students, and she kind of just shared with me her first thoughts after her team's launch.
After the first launch, I thought my rocket didn't go as high as the others, and I'm thinking to improve my rocket, I'm gonna make the tube tighter so the air can push it out more. But I don't know, I felt like the first time it didn't go as planned, but I thought that the height was gonna make it go more up, but it didn't. But I really enjoyed it. It was really fun to do.
So there she shares how she wasn't really pleased with how the first one went. It didn't go as planned, but she's already making plans for how she can improve it. And they're going to be given that opportunity over the next few days of this week. Okay, so now we're going to look at mathematical practice 2. And that mathematical practice.
After the first launch.
There we go, sorry. Mathematical practice 2 is all about reasoning abstractly and quantitatively. And I'm going to show this video. I'm hoping you can hear some of the conversation they're having, but I'll make sure to kind of go over what's happening. This is part of our data analysis. So they've been given the vertical motion formula. And let me just preface this. So I put the vertical motion formula on the board. H of t equals negative 16 t squared plus bt plus s. And the first response I get from a student in first period is, this isn't math, this is English. That's way too many letters. And so I was like, but think about it, guys. Every one of those letters represents some sort of number, a measurement calculation. I said, this is S represents start height. Do we know the start height? We got even measuring our rocket when it was on the launcher. Exactly. That's something we're going to be able to substitute in. This is just the general formula we can use. And so they're having to reason abstractly and quantitatively as they're determining what their data that they collected represents in that formula, and they're substituting that in to solve for the unknown parts. And that's the conversation you're going to hear here.
So this is your 2 times, right? You add those together and then divide by 2. Yes. Okay.
You know how to do this.
Okay, so
You have the student standing here. He was like, what do I do with these numbers? And we did multiple trials. So the student sitting explaining, you have to take those 2 numbers and add them together. That's your average time. We were talking about how some of our timers may have been a little more trigger happy, and that's why we took multiple times for each trial. And so he was explaining that, and he was like, so this goes in parentheses here, and he's like, yeah, because that's what it means. And you heard really awesome conversations happening where the student helping another student reason through what numbers actually represent what in the real world context. So mathematical practice 3, one more thing I want to say about mathematical practice 2. So I adapted this virtually. Some of my virtual students didn't get to build and launch their rockets. I gave them the opportunity and went community materials to do that, but none of them elected to do so. But they still took part of the design process, the feedback and critique process that we did to get that, help one another improve upon our designs. And then now we're doing the data analysis with the real data we collected from our in-person students. And so just yesterday, I had an open Google Meet where they were supposed to be working on their data analysis, and I had a student log on and say, Mr. Wright, I created my algebraic model and I was working on my graph, but isn't the x-intercept supposed to be the same as the time it took the rocket to the ground? I was like, yeah, you're right. He's like, well, my graph's showing a different number. It's off just a little bit. And I was like, well, let's go back and look at your work. And he had already had all his work typed up in the document. And so we looked through and we realized that he had a mistake in adding up some of the like terms. And he noticed that mistake because he was reasoning the real world context into that algebraic model that he created. And he knew that x-intercept and what it was supposed to represent was not matching up with the real world data he had, which was a really awesome moment, a really awesome conversation. It all happened through chat and Google. Wasn't even in person. So that was a cool moment. So mathematical practice 3, we construct viable arguments and critique the reasoning of others. So like I said, they were giving each other feedback. The example on the left is student work, a Google Doc where virtual students were paired up and they shared their design with each other. And so they were asked to screenshot or snip that design they were shared into that box, and then they were given guidelines for feedback. So they had to share 3 positives about the design. They had to kind of help assess how their design met the rubric. So they were helping each other improve upon the design and hopefully improving their chances of making a good grade according to the rubric. And then they were supposed to ask any questions they had that would hopefully help them think through any changes or adaptations they might want to make before they submitted their final draft. And so we have a sample of some student feedback there where they're critiquing the reasoning of the person who created their design. And then another thing, they created blueprints before they were allowed to build. And I told them their rocket that they built had to match their blueprint. Any changes that they had to make, they had to share justification for. So they were given the sheet and they had to list any modifications and why they made them. So they're creating an argument for why that change needed to be made. And so like this group said that they had to change the wings because they had to make the bottom more stable, and the materials that they originally had planned wasn't going to work the way we thought it would when they were planning it out. And they hot glued the nose instead of tape to make sure no air was getting out of the rocket. So they're creating that argument to justify the choices that they're making in their design process. Mathematical practice 4 is all about modeling with mathematics. So not only did they have to create a blueprint, build their design, and you see some geometric solids there, they labeled their measurements because that was part of the rubric, is that they had to include the estimation of what they wanted things to measure. So that they're creating that model of the rocket before they even build it. And then this is actually the work that the student I was sharing with earlier, my virtual student, who noticed the difference in his x-intercept and the data, where he has taken the data that was given, and everything highlighted is stuff he added in. So he was given that the start height was 47.5 inches, and that the rocket hit the ground at 1.48 seconds. And he had to convert the inches into feet and use that vertical motion formula to figure out the initial velocity to create this model, the algebraic function that represents the rocket height in terms of time. And then he used that algebraic model to then use Desmos to help him create that graphical model. And so now he can use that to answer those questions for his final presentation that he's going to put together. Okay, here we talk about mathematical practice 5, using appropriate tools strategically. So in the video, this is just a short clip of one of our launches. Not a super successful one, but I chose this video because in the background you can see multiple students with their hands like this because they were using timers to collect data. And we had a student that was collecting data, and we also were taking measurements before they launched and things like that. So they're using those tools to measure what's happening with their rockets. And then the reason I included this little image up here in the top right is because as they were building, of course, they were only given certain materials they could use. So they had to think through what material is going to work best for what I need this to do. Well, these girls were working on the rocket, and they were like, "Miss Wright, do you have a fabric ruler?" And I was like, "No, I don't have one of those. I only have like the straight edge type ruler." And they're like, "Well, we need to measure around our rocket's body." And I was like, "You mean the circumference?" And we started talking about the formula. They said, like, "Isn't there a formula for that?" And I was like, "Yeah, you can measure, the diameter across." And I was like, "Wait, don't you have like this little string on your desk?" I said, "Let's think about how we could use this to more easily measure." I said, "What if we took that string and wrapped it around the body of our rocket and then stretch that string out to the ruler? And you could measure it that way." "Oh yeah, that's great." So they're learning how to use what's available to them to more easily solve problems in the real world and accomplish the tasks that they have in front of them. Okay, so mathematical practice 6 is all about attending to precision. So I had a conversation with them at the beginning, and I won't show that video. Well, yeah, I can. So we talked about the importance of,
to try to control as many things as we can. We want to be as precise.
actually, you can't hear that very well, so we won't watch that. But I was telling him that as we collect data, we want to definitely do multiple trials. We want to, because you might have one launch that goes great and one that's just, a flub. And we want to have multiple trials to be able to collect the most accurate data we can. We had multiple timers so that if one person fell asleep and didn't push the button when they were supposed to, we had multiple data options to choose from, and we averaged those together. They were, so you can see a sample of the data they collected. And for each launch, we recorded the start height again because sometimes they push that rocket a little bit further down on the launch tube and things. So we talked about needing to attend to precision, and as we've been doing our data analysis, we talked about rounding and how much that changes their answer. When our students were rounding different things, it changed how high their rocket might have launched by tens or more feet. So we've been having that conversation, and then another thing, they have given opportunities to self-assess with the rubrics about this. So I had a student who shared some notes as he self-assessed his rocket design. He made some notes of how he thought he met that achieving criteria, or even went beyond it, but also any concerns he had where he felt like he didn't meet the rubric, had a chance to fix it before he turned in that final copy. So they're attending to precision with their work as well.
To try to control as many things as we
Every
can.
time I
We
hit
want
the
to be as
over button,
precise as we can.
there we go. So this is the mathematical practice that I didn't think I was going to have evidence of until they were working yesterday in class, and I ended up catching. I was like, "Can I video your conversation?" And it went somewhere I didn't expect it to, because I was telling you before, I got really guilty of monkey see, monkey do. Like, I would do that in practice, and my students would just be able to do it because they were mimicking what I had done on the board. Well, you're gonna see that. And so then I asked them why they did something, and you'll see the male student there go, well, it's because you did it. I was like, that's not what I wanted to hear. But it turned into a really good conversation where we looked at the structure of the equation, and it started making sense to what they were doing.
Okay, so you're gonna write the V, your parentheses 2.38, and then plus 3.17. Yeah. And then after that, and then I think you're gonna multiply negative 16 times 32.6, wait, whatever our number is. That times that. Yeah.
Plus, and this is our loss code, so 29, 7, 8, plus.
And then take away the parentheses. Okay, just making sure. Huh? Yeah, just write them without the parentheses. Just write this without the parentheses. And put the V at the end. Like, ours is gonna be.
So why did you do that?
I don't know. It's what you do.
And that was not what I was. Why would you just rearrange it that way?
I'm clueless.
I mean, you're doing a really good job of monkey see, monkey do. Miss Wright did it that way, so I'm gonna do it that way. But I want you to understand why you did it that way. Okay, so what does V sitting beside this 2.38 mean mathematically? What's it doing to each other if it's sitting beside it?
You're solving for V.
We are solving for V, but what does V sitting beside 2.38 even mean mathematically? What does 3 sitting beside an X mean? What operation does that imply? Multiplication, right? When something's sitting beside something. And so if we're doing V times 2.38, typically we write the variable last. So that's why we just rearranged it to say 2.38V. Because it's the same, they're just multiplying them together, and we can't multiply a variable with a number to simplify any farther than just sitting them beside each other. Okay, so far you've simplified order of operations, you simplified the exponents, and you simplified the multiplication. What are you gonna do next? Good.
So they were doing a really good job of mimicking everything I did, but they were just mimicking. They weren't really understanding the process of simplifying and solving that equation. They knew they were solving for V, but they weren't understanding the steps. And so it was a good moment to stop and pause and talk about what the mathematics they were writing actually meant and why they were writing it the way that I had on the board. Why would I do that? In the last mathematical practice is mathematical practice 8, looking for and expressing regularity and repeated reasoning. We are getting into our project finale of the final assessment, and they're going to be taking all the data from themselves and their classmates and comparing, okay, I know this rocket is the best. What was it about this rocket that made it more successful? And they're going to be able to look at patterns in the data to make more informed decisions for modifications for their own rockets. So I don't have student samples of that just yet, but that is something that they're going to be pulling in. So if you want to try to integrate more STEM in your classroom, where can you start? Because this was me. I knew I needed to integrate STEM, but like I said, when it came to Algebra 2, I didn't even know where to pull in the phenomena that I could use to teach my content that would make my Algebra 2 more relevant. And so we, as part of the Endeavor courses, have been shown a lot of different NASA resources and even resources beyond NASA that have allowed me to go in and find not only data, but also lesson ideas. And these are a few that I've used for lessons that I've created in my courses and for my classroom. The NASA Jet Propulsion Laboratory is a site, and there's a link on that slide there that pulls up like a whole list of resources that you can access. But the Jet Propulsion Laboratory actually has lesson ideas that you can search for by subject level, grade level, and things like that. So that's a great resource to use. And then we actually collaborated, the teachers that are in my building that are in this grant, to create a lesson over sea level change. And you go to the NASA Global Climate Change, and that's real-time, up-to-date data from many years past. I believe even on this, it shows back to like 1900 of the global temperature. And so you can use that data for students to analyze and make predictions of where will our planet be in 10 years. And you can pull in your a real world phenomenon to make your content more meaningful to your students. So this link actually pulls up a document that has all kinds of great resources. So if you don't know where to start, hopefully this would give you some resources to go to. Even if not before the school year, maybe over the summer, you can look for ways that you might can make one lesson a little more STEM integrated. Okay, so that is kind of the conclusion of everything. I would love if you guys would stop here. And I'm going to ask you one more time to go to that Desmos activity. And I would love for you to share with me maybe a takeaway from this session today. So we rated ourselves on the STEM spectrum earlier. And like I said, I was at 7th grade, I'm trying to take baby steps to integrate more STEM. So I'm trying to move a little bit to the right. But what's something that you think you can do to take, maybe even if it's just a baby step, a little step closer to the integrated side of that spectrum? How can we bring more STEM to our students and give them more engaging real world problems to solve? And while you guys are sharing that, I am going to share with you the rocket launch montage. So these are all the rockets that have videos for my students. You'll see some great ones and some flubs. I even had a student who had a little temper tantrum when his rocket did not leave the launcher. So he might have stomped his rocket. And you'll get to see that as a little bit of comedic relief. But we're going to watch this and the evaluation that's linked in the agenda if you want to work on that during this time as well. Like I said, some more successful than others. This is my best one. Ever two. If they went to fix theirs in the house. So you can see that the Friday before spring break was a fun day for my classes, and they really enjoyed it, and they're dying to go out and do it again after they have a chance to improve their designs. So that's all I have for you guys. Are there any questions for me or anything that you guys want to share? I appreciate you all attending today. Hope you got something out of it that you can take back to your school or classroom. You guys enjoy the rest of the day.